June of 2022, this bill passes with, of course, no public hearings, no committee hearings. It's a budget trailer bill. It gets proposed, it gets passed. Until AB 205, the more you used in terms of electricity, the more you'd pay. And that was to incent and encourage conservation. The less you use, the less you pay. And with these outrageously high bills, because of PG&E's profiteering and spending money on unnecessary stuff that makes them money, people are trying to cut their electric bill whenever they can. But this will completely blow that out of the water.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today, we're glad to be joined by Loretta Lynch, former California Public Utility Commissioner. Loretta, how's it going? And thanks for joining us.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Jared.
Yeah, for those of us who don't know a lot about your background and who think you might be the former U.S. attorney, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, number one, Loretta E. Lynch is shorter than I am. And she went to Harvard and I went to Yale.
Okay.
So I'm Loretta M. Lynch, and I grew up in Independence, Missouri, which is where Harry Truman's from, went to USC for college, worked in the state legislature as an assembly fellow, and then hightailed it to law school, came back, worked for a judge, and have worked for legal aid, worked for private law firms, and also worked for Gray Davis as his director of his OPR director. And then he appointed me to the PUC just in time for the energy crisis.
Yeah. So can you kind of give us the landscape of kind of like, I guess, the energy landscape at that time and kind of how it's changed since then?
Sure. In 1996, the legislature had passed what they called energy deregulation, but really what it was energy federalization. They, in 1996, broke down state control and handed over the reins to the feds through an organized electricity market. And not surprisingly, the participants in that organized market fleeced California incredibly. So Enron and its compadres came into what was then kind of a wild, wild west of prices and supply, and artificially withheld supply to increase the price in a coordinated, I would argue, RICO coordinated kind of manner. And then they made out like bandits until we stopped it. So I was a partner at Kecker and Van Nest in San Francisco, and they specialize in white collar criminal defense. So I had defended my share of white collar companies. So when I came to the PUC, it sure looked to me like the companies that were playing in California's energy market were coordinating and colluding, much like what I had seen before in private practice. So the first thing I did was issue 127 subpoenas to all the players in the market, and they lawyered up. And I knew what that meant, because when you lawyer up, you got something to hide. Otherwise, you cooperate with the government. And not one energy player cooperated with the state of California. So we went after them. And Bill Lockyer, as the Attorney General at the time, and I were finally successful after many years of clawing back some of the money that they owed California and also repairing some of the damage that the sweeping AB 1890 Jim Brulte's bill did to California. So right now we're in a weird hybrid system in California, 20 plus years later, where we do have an organized electricity market, but it is California controlled. The California ISO is a creature of state law. It's a state chartered private corporation that runs our market and runs the transmission grid. However, the utilities still own the actual wires, the lines. And the reason for that is because they profit off of that ownership. And we have some protections in that the governor appoints the board members of the ISO and the Senate confirms them. So we have political control over the board of the ISO. And then it's a mixed bag about what rules the ISO has to follow. As a California corporation, they have to follow California law. But their tariffs about how their market is run are approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. So their tariffs are approved by the feds, but they have to follow California law. And the ISO has a schizophrenic personality because of that. And that's where we are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just kind of looking back at that time, I remember like the rolling blackouts, and it was always in the summertime and your air conditioning would go out, and people kind of upset about that. And it's kind of come back in what the last couple of years with the fires and the energy peaks and stuff like that. Kind of where are we at in today's energy market in production and things like that in comparison to where we were back in the late 90s?
Well, the problem is, I convinced FERC and also California to institute some protections, some guardrails on the market. And the problem is the three biggest guardrails that FERC agreed to in 2000 and 2001 have now all expired. And so here we are, and they expired just in time for those blackouts of the summer of 2020, and then the blackouts of the summer of 2022. So I am quite concerned that the sons of Enron are writing again today, and that they are engaging in some of the same behaviors that we saw 20 plus years ago. And it's not just me who believes that, because the independent market monitor, which is supposed to monitor how the market runs in the ISO, raised issues about the withholding of power in 2020 as one of the causes of the blackouts, and also the exporting of power outside of California on the hottest summer days when our demand is highest. So this exporting game basically artificially reduces supply and causes artificial shortages, which increases the price. And then when the price is high enough, the sellers sell the power back in the market. The problem is in 2020 and 2022, they got it wrong. The ISO got it wrong, and that's when we had blackouts. So I am really a big advocate for stronger controls over the ISO and different tariffs that the ISO should be proposing right now to protect California pursuant to state law mandates.
And it's kind of interesting. So basically, can you explain to us, amateurs, what the ISO is and kind of what are they supposed to do? What is their job?
The ISO runs the transmission grid. So it gets power from where it's made, the power plants, to where it's used, the load centers, the cities, the farms, everybody, right? So it goes from where it's made to where it's needed. And they're supposed to run that under state law, because they're a state law corporation, for the benefit of California consumers, health, safety, and environment. And they are supposed to run the grid in a manner that maximizes resources available to Californians, meaning don't export power when we need it out of California, and minimizes cost to customers, meaning don't allow these guys to play games to create artificial shortages, raise the price, and then sell it back to us at an inflated price. Right. So that's where that's what they're supposed to do.
And then
in addition, they also run the markets. So they run where they buy and sell power. So they run the transmission grid about actually physically getting the power from where it's made to where it's needed. And then they run the markets. What's the price of that power and who's selling power to who? And the shenanigans are happening in both places. How the power is delivered, the sons of Enron are creating artificial clogs, and then the ISO pays them to reroute the power on lines that would actually cover the power that they say they're going to run, and then also artificially creating shortages that increases the price. So we got a real problem brewing, and we've seen the results of that problem in 2020 and in 2022. And the problem here is the administration is saying, hey, we have a shortage, right? That's exactly what the George Bush administration said in 2000. And so therefore just buy more power. And right now, California has about a 25% reserve, meaning we have contracted for 25% more power than we actually will ever need, just in case, right? Just as a reserve to guard against these manipulative games. Problem is, if you've got a hole in the bucket, if you're exporting power that we've contracted for when we need it most, it doesn't matter how much more power you pour in that bucket. As long as there's a hole, you're never going to have a full bucket.
Right.
And so you got to plug the hole, and then you don't need to overspend and overbuy in order to keep the lights on in California.
And I guess it's interesting. So the Cal ISO knows how much power we're going to use. They predict the future, right? And then they're supposed to, deliver that much power, right? Or is there a little buffer they're supposed to give us as well?
And there's a buffer. And so right now our buffer is 25%, which is one of the highest buffers in the country. For technical purposes, you need about a 5 to 10% buffer in case a transmission line goes down or some other technical problem happens. But you sure don't need to overbuy 25%. And so then there are games that are played within that. Uh, so ultimately, we've got some problems in our ISO market. I'm really hoping that the governor and the legislature turn a hard eye on the ISO's policies and practices and just do not allow them to export power out of California when we need it most, because under state law, they're not supposed to.
Yeah. You've been, a big advocate for ratepayers. Can you kind of explain to us some of your biggest victories you've had for ratepayers over your career?
Yeah. Well, I certainly tried to hold the utilities to account when I was on the PUC, and I have to say, I was not their favorite person. But ultimately, the way that California regulates its utilities is critical to how our economy runs. And then, of course, we have all sorts of other additional issues, like are we regulating utilities in a way that will promote, uh, uh, you know, greenhouse gas emission reductions and our climate policies, things like that. So, one thing that I tried to do was take a sharp pencil to unnecessary costs of the utilities. And also, I was one of the first commissioners to fine PG&E for failing to trim their trees and failing to use the money that the PUC gave them in the 1990s to make their system safe. But little did I know just what was lurking underground in the form of San Bruno and the pipelines, and just how extraordinarily negligent PG&E was in not maintaining their systems and keeping them safe. It's not just me that's saying that. They are a convicted felon for their criminal negligence in not maintaining their gas pipelines and not maintaining their electrical systems. So PG&E is now a multiply convicted felon for its criminal negligence, unlike the other private utilities in the state.
I guess that's a big question is, how can a company like PG&E, who repeatedly, just can't get their stuff together over decades, still in business and able to kind of play in the regulated utility box?
Because it's by the grace of the Public Utilities Commission, the governor's office, and the legislature. We could take PG&E over, but for SB 250, the Hill bill in 2020, that created this complicated bureaucratic mechanism that if PG&E kept killing people and kept being adjudged criminally negligent, then maybe they'd be turned into a private nonprofit corporation. But really, that's not the answer. PG&E is a rogue utility that has co-opted its regulators, and it's not accountable to anyone, frankly. And so why wouldn't it continue to spend money on profiteering, on its executive bonuses, and on unnecessary infrastructure upgrades that will just continue to allow it to profiteer when no one in state government is holding it accountable?
Yeah. I think just, living in this area, one of the biggest hacks ever is living in Sacramento County. And if you've ever lived outside of Sacramento County for a little bit and then moved back in, you realize that your energy bill is literally like 4 times more expensive outside Sacramento County than inside. And that's because PG&E regulates outside of Sacramento County than inside. Can you explain, just for our listeners, SMUD and how they're able to subsidize our rates compared to these other utilities outside of Sacramento?
Sure, they don't subsidize the rates. They pay for everything that you need to keep the lights on, and they are going greener. So, public utilities owned by a government, and that could be a state government, a city government, a regional government. It can also be a different kind of governmental entity like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Public utilities don't make profits, and so they don't base their decisions on whether or not it makes them a profit. So SMUD, LADWP, and the 24 other public utilities throughout California that serve 20% of California's families and businesses, those folks are making decisions based on safety, reliability, and getting greener. They are not making decisions on, will this make us more money, and will this provide executives and shareholders more money?
Right.
And that is what the private utilities do. And one could argue from a corporate governance standpoint, that's what they should be doing. If the government of California is going to allow them to profiteer, don't they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to profiteer? And so my argument is the regulator should be a watchdog and not a lapdog. And so PG&E spends a lot of time and effort and money at the PUC to get what it wants in order for it to profiteer. So, for instance, California private utilities have some of the highest profit levels set by the PUC in the country. And those profit levels bear no relationship to the risks that the California utilities take. because in California, it's a very utility friendly state when it comes to state law and state PUC regulation. So one could argue that the utilities bear a much lesser risk in California than in virtually any other state. And so they should have a lower profit level, which is called a rate of return. But that's not true. And I want to give you just one example of just how egregious the profiteering is. During the pandemic, the PUC had set the utilities profit levels at 10% plus a little more, 10.2, 10.3%. And the utilities agreed that if they over-earned, made more than that in profit, they would promptly return the over-earnings or the excess profits to the ratepayers, to customers. Well, guess what? During the pandemic, they did reap excess profits to the tune of about $600 million statewide. And instead of promptly returning the excess to the ratepayers, which they agreed to do, instead they asked the PUC, hey, could we keep them? Because, the pandemic. And you would think that the PUC would slap them back saying, look, in 2019, you specifically agreed to automatically return them if you over-earned, if you reaped excess profits of a particular amount. But no, in December of 2022, the PUC allowed the utilities to keep over $600 million in excess profits. And then the next month, they set the profit level even higher.
Right. And it's kind of like, as Californians, I guess we're just kind of like, the frogs in the pot that are slowly being boiled. There's, we're all outraged by our bills, but, we don't know where to turn to. And now I guess there's this new proposal that's going to, I guess, set our rates by our income levels. Can you kind of talk about that?
I sure can. So AB 205, which was the budget trailer bill from the Budget Committee in 2022, requires the PUC to consider imposing a minimum monthly bill based on the customer's income. Now, this is just residential, not business customers, right? And it's wrapped in language about worrying about low-income customers. So it definitely has some protections for the lowest income customers, the poverty level customer, and that they shouldn't have to pay more. But it says nothing about anybody who's making more than poverty level. And what it does do is it blows the cap. It eliminates the current cap on what the minimum monthly bill can be without setting any kind of limit on what the PUC can do. So June of 2022, this bill passes with, of course, no public hearings, no committee hearings. It's a budget trailer bill. It gets proposed, it gets passed, boom. But very clearly, the Senate floor analysis explains that this will be an income-based fixed fee, which just upends decades of how we make rates and how we charge customers here in California for electricity. Until AB 205, the more you used in terms of electricity, the more you'd pay.
Right.
And that was to incent and encourage conservation, right? The less you use, the less you pay. And with these outrageously high bills, because of PG&E's profiteering and spending money on unnecessary stuff that makes them money, people are trying to cut their electric bill whenever they can. But this will completely blow that out of the water. And it will also have extraordinary implications for California's privacy. Because who are we going to report our income to? That's a huge issue that's left unaddressed in this bill. And then what mechanisms are going to be developed, all at what cost, to verify people's income so that they're charged the appropriate amount based on their income. So California here is leading
it just seems so bizarre.
Most of the nation for no good reason, except for this got stuffed into a budget trailer bill in 2022 with very little analysis, zero public debate, and no ability for consumer advocates and environmental advocates to say, hey, wait a minute, what are you thinking? Or privacy advocates.
Right. So your energy bill won't be based on how much energy you use, but how much money you make? Is that kind of
Well, a part of it will be based on how much energy you use, and then a part of it will be based on how much money you make.
So you can afford to pay more, so you will pay more. Maybe.
Well, except for really what this is just a shell game of the utilities costs are blowing apart. They're just increasing so rapidly because of prior bad decisions and current bad decisions. Instead of addressing those bad decisions and stopping the cost escalation, they're just rearranging the deck chairs. They're rearranging the shells to say, hey, we'll hide some of those costs under this shell, and we'll put some of these costs under that shell, and maybe people won't notice that their bills are going up. But under the proposal, we don't know what the PUC is going to adopt because they haven't come out with a published proposed decision. But what the utilities want is they want folks who are making less than $70,000 to maybe be okay and maybe not have to pay more. Really kind of unclear, actually. They might have to pay another 10 or 20 bucks a month. But then people making over 70,000 to 180,000 would be paying a lot more. And any family making over 180,000 would be paying about $1,500 more a year.
Wow.
So we're talking 120 bucks more a month just because you make over 180,000. That's
and a
crazy.
lot of people, have invested in solar to offset their bill. That would be that wouldn't be part of this, right? Because it's just like a minimum fee, right? So if you had solar,
it's a minimum
you'd still be
fee,
paying.
no matter how much you use. If you are connected to the grid, you're going to pay 100. Let's just call it 100 bucks a month more, at least, if you make over 180, and you're going to pay 50 or 60 bucks a month more, at least, if you make over $70,000 as a family, right? As a family, if you make over $70,000.
Wow.
I know. So that is just nuts from my perspective. So instead of stopping the source of the problem, which is burgeoning costs because the PUC is a lapdog and won't cut the costs, what they're doing is they're just rearranging who has to pay for it. Now, the other unfair part of this is they're going to have 3 tiers. So there'll be, low income folks, and then middle income folks, and then over 180,000 folks. Now, the PUC could also call that over 150 or over 100,000. They can set the tier wherever they want. And those folks, if you make 180,000, you're going to be paying the same amount per month as Mark Zuckerberg or any other billionaire. So, they may not notice their bill going up 150 bucks a month. I'm going to notice my bill going up 150 bucks a month, let me tell you.
Right.
So that it's just crazy. And are there any limits on what the utilities can spend this found money for? Nope. It could all go to profit.
They could all go to executive bonuses, right? Or fines.
Hey, my bet is the executives will make out like bandits in 2024 if this puppy actually gets passed at the PUC, because they will have increased the utilities' money for no good reason. No good reason. So we're going to put a drag on California's economy. We're going to upend all of our incentives to conserve energy, which is a great idea for the environment as well as for our pocketbooks. And we're going to create some unknown, who knows if it's safe, bureaucracy for the reporting of people's income and the checking to make sure they're not lying. How much is that going to cost? That'll be paid for by us too. In service of what? There's just no reason for this. And in fact, it's so clear that there's no reason for this that recently 22 state legislators wrote a letter to the PUC saying, hey, wait a minute, you got to look at this. Is this going to increase costs for people? And what are you doing with the money? And then recently, Senator Josh Becker and Assemblymember Mark Berman wrote an op-ed saying, this was a bad idea.
Yeah.
Let's figure out real solutions to these increased costs and not this.
They're like, we voted for the budget, but we didn't know this.
We didn't really realize that one of the 10 provisions in the energy trailer bill was this. How ridiculous. Because frankly, other big things like the energy trailer bill was sold with a $1.2 billion fund to help people after the pandemic who were behind on their electric bills. And so people wanted to make sure they got assistance to folks who needed it.
Right.
And then tucked right in here was this little income-based monthly fee, which is just a little Christmas bonus to the utilities for no good reason.
Unbelievable. Kind of what as citizens, what can we do to kind of keep the PUC accountable and kind of voice our concerns about this stuff?
Well, on this one, the solar tax with a monthly minimum fee is not cooked yet at the PUC. But what you can do is you can call the governor's office and you can call your state legislator and say, hey, repeal AB 205, the section that requires an income-based tiered monthly set fee. And just as you probably know, but maybe your listeners don't, the governor's office number is 916-445-2841. You can certainly call and say, hey, 205, AB 205 from 2022 was ill-considered, and just repeal that section so that the PUC doesn't have to take this cockamamie step.
Right.
Because the problem is, you read the bill says the PUC may do this, but then later it says it shall. And so I'm just going to read that because, you start with the legislation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it says very sadly, I'm going to just pull this up, that the commission shall, no later than July 1st, 2024, authorized a fixed charge for default residential rates. And then later in that section 739.1, it talks about how that fixed charge needs to work. And so that's what's going to happen. And just so you know, the FTB has kind of said, we want no part of this, the Franchise Tax Board.
Like,
where
how are
you would,
they going to have the manpower to go through this all and set your rate? It's going to be unbelievable.
Oh, no. The FTB is saying, we're not touching this pile, right? Because it's steaming. And we got plenty to do as the FTB. So go figure out how you're going to do this income-based reporting and verification some other way.
Right.
So do we want a private corporation to know our income? Or would you rather just give it up to PG&E?
Yeah, we'll just have to post it on social media, I guess, maybe.
Right. And then is PG&E going to be looking at your tax return just to verify that that's what your income was?
Right.
How are we going to do this? And at what cost? And of course, PG&E is going to want their profit for doing that, as any private corporation is going to want. So how much is it going to cost, even if this were a good idea, which it's not? How much is it going to cost to implement this idea? And what are they going to do if they catch somebody lying?
Right.
Because there's no power of the government behind that.
Exactly.
It's just nuts.
Yeah.
And let's just say ill-considered.
Definitely. Just kind of, I guess, digging into rates in general, kind of, as the PUC looks at these different utilities, kind of how do they ensure that the rates are fair, that, but the utilities are also, spending their money and investing in infrastructure and technology upgrades?
Exactly. That is the big question about how does the PUC ensure that? Because the law is clear that energy rates must be just and reasonable, or they are unlawful. And that language dates from the Great Depression of the 1930s. And that language is included in every single state across the country, that electric and gas rates must be just and reasonable, or they are unlawful. And there's a whole hundreds of people at the PUC whose job it is to dig into the utilities' asserted costs and determine, are they just and are they reasonable, or they can't charge them. And that is really where the system has gone off the rails, because from my perspective, the PUC no longer does a good job of that. And instead, pretty much, with some exceptions, and there is one exception right now happening at the PUC, just takes the utilities' word for it. And so the utilities, being private corporations, are coming up with infrastructure costs and programs and build-outs and wildfire safety programs, that's what they call them, that don't work, but pad their profits, pad their bottom line.
Right.
And it's really up to the PUC to figure out how they don't work and to just say no. But instead, especially when it comes to solar, right now the PUC has on its agenda a decision that is going to completely upend how schools, farms, and multifamily businesses get paid for solar, which will pretty much kill off the solar industry in California. So just when we need that local solar the most, it's the safest, the cleanest, and we don't have to pay for big transmission lines to bring it to us from that power plant in Arizona or Nevada or Kern County. Just when we should be encouraging solar, the PUC is poised to really just make it impossible for solar to pencil out economically. And who does that benefit? It benefits the utilities, because who owns those transmission lines and profits from them? The utilities.
Interesting. It seems like, kind of what you're telling us, there's like um, an inconsistency between the legislature here and the laws they're implementing to make us greener and cleaner, want us 100% renewable, and kind of what's going on at the bureaucratic level. Kind of why is there a disconnect, and kind of how can that can be fixed?
Well, let's be clear. AB 205 came from the governor's office and the legislature, right? The
Mhm.
PUC wasn't saying, hey, we'd like to implement an income based fee. I mean, I'm a big critic of the PUC, but on this one, the poo is not on their shoe on this,
Right.
right? If I can say that on your podcast. So that was a legislative mandate. And then we also have AB 1054, which was passed in 2019, which basically it completely changed the standards of liability and also what the PUC can look at when they decide whether or not a cost is just, a wildfire related cost is just. So no longer can the PUC look at the past behavior of the utility in deciding whether the current cost is just. So they can't, for instance, anymore look at, hey, we gave the utility money before to fix this and they didn't use it. And now they're coming back and asking us for more money. Why, go use the money we gave you before. AB 1054 arguably disallows that. And then, of course, it changes the standard of proof. Crazily, in every other state of the country, if the utility wants to take money out of the customer's pocket, they bear the burden of proof for proving that the cost is just and reasonable. AB 1054 changed that for any wildfire related cost. And now, in this state of California, if the utility asserts that they incurred a wildfire cost, it is per se just and reasonable because the burden of proof is not on them. The burden of proof is on some other random party to prove that it isn't just and reasonable.
Right.
So guess what? All of a sudden, PG&E's wildfire-related spending has shot through the roof because if they say it, they get it, unless somebody else proves that they shouldn't, which is a really big burden on all the other players and all the other parties at the PUC. And that was a legislative mandate that thankfully not all the legislators voted for. And as you know, because so many of the legislators are new since 2019, most of the current legislature did not vote for that law, which has now had the very intended consequence of increasing PG&E's costs, increasing their profits, and making the ratepayers' bills higher.
Wow.
I know.
Kind of as we just touched on, the legislature has all these green mandates of 100% renewable by like 2035 or something like that, or
Mhm.
2050, or who knows
Right.
what these years are now. Kind of how feasible is that? How feasible is it for us to go 100% renewable?
Well, technologically, we could do it. The technology exists to transition from fossil to renewable fuel sources. And that wasn't true even 10 years ago. But because of the advances in battery storage, because of the advances in wind and solar technology, California could go completely carbon free by the mandated times. The question I have when it comes to feasibility is at what cost?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because if we allow the utilities to spend like drunken sailors, and that's really offense to the drunken sailor here, um, then our costs are already too high. And then where are you going to get the money to then make that transition, right? And if you're going to have if you're going to require the utilities to buy 25% more power than is projected that they need, just because the ISO can't run their market efficiently or appropriately or without collusive rates and consequences, then where are you going to get the money to buy even more renewable power? So you got to make choices when it comes to utility regulation and costs. And that's really where this PUC is falling down on the job and this ISO. Because what California did with deregulation was they broke the link between who orders the costs and who requires the payment. So right now, the PUC's job is to decide who pays what costs, hence the shell game of this monthly set fee based on income, because they're presented this bill of enormous costs and they have to figure out who's going to pay for it.
Right.
But the ISO can just spin like a drunken sailor and can allow all these sellers to price their product way too high through a bunch of these transmission and market games. And then they present the bill to the utilities, who present the bill to the PUC, who then presents the bill to you and me and
Yeah.
California businesses.
Kind of.
And pretty soon there's just not enough money to effectively transition. So every time we allow the utilities to over profit or put in infrastructure like all this undergrounding that frankly we don't need so much undergrounding. What we need is PG&E to cover their conductors and to tighten their lines. Cal Fire, anyway, Cal Fire, what we should start with is the facts. What has Cal Fire said causes, what are the actual causes of wildfires? Go fix that.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual causes are line slap, lines hitting a tree, and uncovered conductors. Vast majority. But if you go read the California Natural Resources report, Resources Agency Wildfire Safety Advisory Board report on the utilities' wildfire mitigation plans, you will see that they are critically deficient in actually taking actions that will actually prevent wildfires. What they're doing is they're taking actions that are going to boost their bottom line.
Interesting.
That has to stop.
Right.
Or we're never going to make our climate goals because we won't have the money. Already, California is in the top 5 states in the nation in terms of our electric bills for no good reason, except for that our utilities are overspending and over-earning. And so what we're gonna have the dubious distinction of being number 1 in order to meet our climate goals. So I'm a committed environmentalist, and my view is we should be putting our climate goals above utility profiteering.
No, definitely. Kind of, you've kind of voiced some changes that you've seen over at the PUC and the advent of Cal ISO. Kind of, I guess if you were in charge for the day, kind of what changes would you see made at the PUC and Cal ISO to kind of make it better for Californians?
Stop allowing exports out of California when California needs that power. Stop allowing the sellers to play market games with scheduling transmission on lines that can't hold it and then paying them literally hundreds of millions of dollars to reschedule on a line that can transmit that electricity. I mean, that's just basic doctor science. Why would you allow energy sellers to schedule power on lines that then become congested and then pay them to back off? It's basically using carrots all the time instead of using the clear sticks that the ISO and the PUC has in their toolbox. So if all you're doing is feeding carrots, we pay and pay and pay.
Right.
So start using the sticks.
Interesting. We're just
claw back the $600+ million of admittedly excess profits that the utilities earned in the pandemic and apply that to some of these utility costs and reduce the level of profit that the PUC just allowed the utilities to take out of our pockets every day.
Unbelievable. Well, Loretta, thank you so much for coming and talking with us. Definitely learned a lot. Probably made a whole bunch of people angry, and hopefully, they remember that phone number to call the governor's office.
and your legislator, right?
And
call your assembly person, call your state senator, and say, "Hey, I don't want a monthly utility bill, utility tax. I don't want a monthly minimum bill that's based on my income."
Yeah.
Crazy.
Insane. Well, thanks for educating us. It was always a pleasure. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Loretta.